डॉक्टर बाबासाहेब आंबेडकर ओपन यूनिवर्सिटी.
Good afternoon, dear students. I, Dr. Chintan Waghela, working as an assistant professor at Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar Open University. Dear students, as you all know that we always begin our session by discussing one educational quote. So today's educational quote is all about education is the most powerful weapon which you can use to change the world, which has been said by Nelson Mandela. Dear students, mostly we believe that the tools and the weapons are powerful, but education is much more powerful than all these weapons also. This has been said by Nelson Mandela, and that's why the education is important. So dear students, our today's session is for the third year students. Subject is ENGM 308, Unit 15, An Apology for the Poetry, Part 1. Dear students, I have divided this unit into different parts to understand it very well. So let's discuss the components of today's presentation. First one is background, second one is introduction, third one is Sydney's views on the antiquity and universities of poetry, definition of poetry, and poetry superior to history and philosophy. Dear students, the first slide is all about the background, and in this slide we are having an information about our unit. So let's start this slide. In background in 1579, Stephen Gosson wrote a harsh critique called The School of Abuse. The full article gives a clear hint of its tone. It attacks poets, musicians, actors and entertainers, calling them praises, ruining society. Gosson argued that these artists were morally harmful and used examples from history, logic and everyday life to tear down their value. Though he didn't know poet Philip Sidney personally, Gosson boldly dedicated his book to him. Sidney later wrote an apology for poetry to defend the art form, praising poetry as vital to society and culture, while Sidney never directly mentions Gosson or his book. Parts of his essay seem to quietly counter Gosson's arguments. Instead of firing back with insults, Sidney focused on uplifting poetry's role in inspiring virtue and creativity. The two works create a silent debate, one attacking art, the other passionately defending it. Next slide is all about the introduction. Let's discuss. Sir Philip Sidney's An Apology for the Poetry, Defense of Poesy is considered one of the greatest literary critics of the European Renaissance. W.K. Wimsett noted that Sidney wrote it in response to a moralist's harsh criticism of poetry, arguing that poets create a world more beautiful than a nature itself, a golden world, compared to nature's brazen one. Engaging and accessible, Sidney's work remains a source of inspiration, just as an essayist must master writing, so must a critic an apology for poetry. It also showcases this skill. Modern readers may struggle with it because they overlook that it was shaped by a specific attack on poetry, influencing Sydney's arguments and approach. Next slide is all about Sydney's views on antiquity and universality of poetry. Let's discuss that what is the Sydney's views. Sydney opens an apology for poetry with a light-hearted anecdote about an inquiry in the Waisen's Court, humorously setting the tone of his defense of poetry. He argues that poetry is the foundation of all knowledge, describing it as the first source of enlightenment across various cultures from Greece to Wales. The Latin Vates, Prophet and Greek poets highlight poetry's divine insight and creative power. Unlike other arts that follow nature, poetry transcends, transforming reality into beauty. Also inspired by thinkers like Plotinus and Scaliger, Sydney's ideas later influenced Shelley's defense of poetry, which yet called the most profound essay on poetry's foundations. Poetry does not merely idealize nature, it elevates humanity, as seen in legendary figures like Aeneas and Cyrus. Sydney clarifies that calling poets creators is no irreverence to God. Rather, it depends our understanding of human perfection and biblical idea of man being made in God's image. Next slide is all about the definitions of poetry. Let's discuss that which kind of definitions of poetry we have in this slide. Sydney explores poetry's scope by defining it as an art of imitation, describing it as a speaking picture meant to both teach and delight. He further explains that poetry creates vivid images of virtues and vices, offering enjoyable moral instruction. Sydney classifies poetry into three different types. Sacred poetry means the oldest and the most revered, philosophical or didactic poetry, which relies on external knowledge, and imaginative poetry means true, where poets freely exercise creativity, while sacred and didactic poets are constrained by theology and external sources. Imaginative poets are the true makers with unrestricted artistic expression. Sydney dismisses the notion that rhyme and verse define poetry, arguing that just as a long robe does not make a lawyer, rhyme alone does not make a poet. He views verse as an embellishment rather than an essential feature of poetry, a stance later echoed by Milton, Wordsworth, and Shelley. For Sydney, poetry transcends metrical constraints and emphasizing imagination and meaning over formal structure. Next slide is all about poetry superior to history and philosophy. Let's discuss. Sydney acknowledges that four main fields of knowledge, theology, law, philosophy, and history, but focuses only on later two, as theology concerns divine matters and law enforces virtue only negatively. He critiques philosophy for being overly analytical, defining virtue in abstract terms rather than inspiring virtuous action. History, though claiming authenticity, relies on second-hand accounts and presents virtue through examples rather than principles. While philosophers teach by precept and historians by example, poetry surpasses both by combining the strength of each. Sidney also argues that poetry offers a perfect picture rather than just wordish descriptions, making moral lessons more engaging and impactful. Unlike history, which merely records events, poetry embodies deeper philosophical truths, illustrating poetic justice more vividly. Since Aristotle held the action is the goal of human activity, poetry's ability to move people makes it superior to both history and philosophy. Its charm appeals to all ages, as seen in famous parables like those of Menenius Agrippa and Nathan. Concluding his argument, Sidney proclaims poetry the most supreme form of knowledge, crowning the poet victorious over both historian and philosopher. So, dear students, I hope you have paid attention for today's session. We will meet for the next session and I will bring the second part of this session. Thanks to all for giving your valuable time. Thank you.
स्वाध्यायः